The stars were still that night. Queen Xylo stood at the wide front window of her ship and looked out at the dark. Her ship, the Sareth Vale, was one of the largest in the Keth Dominion fleet. It moved slowly through the outer edge of the Reth system, doing a routine patrol sweep. The crew was quiet. The engines hummed at a low and steady pace. Everything was normal. Xylo had been queen for 30 years. She had seen battles and peace treaties. She had sat across the table from warlords and ambassadors. She had held her people together through 3 different wars and one very long famine. She was not a woman who was easily surprised by anything. But what her censor chief showed her that night surprised her. "My queen," said Commander Drev, stepping close and keeping his voice low. He was a tall male, gray-scaled, with sharp eyes and a careful manner. He had served on her ship for 12 years, and she trusted his judgment more than almost anyone. "We are picking up the signal from inside the debris field." Xylo turned from the window and looked at the data screen he was holding. "What kind of signal?" "A life pod, human design, class 3. Escape vessel." He paused. "It came from the direction of Reth Station." She looked at him. "Reth Station was destroyed 8 days ago." "Yes, my queen." "Then this pod has been drifting for 8 days, at least 8 days. Possibly a little longer. The debris field made it hard to track exactly." He held the screen closer so she could read the full scan. "The pod has taken damage on 2 sides. Its main battery is almost completely dead. Its heating system has been rerouted in a way that makes no standard sense." Xylo studied the readings carefully. She had seen escape pods before. She had seen what happened to people inside them after a day or 2 without power. After 8 days, a pod like this should have been nothing but a cold metal box with a body inside. "Is there a life signal?" she asked. Drev hesitated for just a moment. "Yes. Very faint, but yes, my queen." The whole bridge had gone quiet. The other crew members were not looking at their screens anymore. They were all listening, though they were pretending not to. Xylo noticed this but said nothing about it. She looked back at the debris field on the main screen. Reth Station had been a human facility. She had never had strong ties to the human nations. The Keth Dominion and the human territories had no formal agreement, no alliance, no shared history worth speaking of. She had no duty to stop for this pod. She had no political reason to get involved. Her patrol route did not require it. Her orders did not call for it. And yet she stood there looking at that faint signal on the screen, and she felt something quiet move inside her chest. She had learned long ago to pay attention to that feeling. "Bring the pod aboard," she said. Drev gave the order without hesitation. It took the retrieval team 20 minutes to pull the pod from the debris field and bring it safely into the lower docking bay. Xylo walked down to the bay herself. Rather than waiting for a report, she wanted to see it. She was not entirely sure why, but she wanted to see it with her own eyes. The pod was smaller than she expected. It was a gray metal oval about the length of 2 Keth adults lying end to end. One side was scorched black from heat damage. There were dents along the bottom edge where it had likely been hit by floating debris. The small circular window near the top was fogged from the inside. The whole thing looked like it had been through something very bad and had barely come out the other side. Salva, her chief medic, was already there with 2 assistants and a full emergency kit. She was scanning the pod before the docking clamps had even fully locked into place. Life signs are weak, Salva said without looking up from her scanner. Oxygen inside is critically low. Body temperature is low but not fatal. Heart rate is slow and irregular. She looked up at Xylo. If we had found this pod 6 hours later, there would have been nothing to save. Open it, Xylo said. The pod's manual release required 2 of the docking crew to pull hard on the outer handle before the seal finally broke with a sharp hiss of stale air. The door swung open slowly. Inside, curled into the small survival seat, was a human male. He was young, that was the first thing Xylo noticed. He looked young even by human standards, which she knew were different from Keth standards. His hair was dark and pushed flat against his forehead. His face was pale and drawn, the skin tight across his cheekbones in a way that spoke of too little food and too little air for too many days. His uniform was the gray and green of a station maintenance worker, not a soldier or a pilot. On the small identification patch above his chest pocket, she could read the letters in standard language. Calvin Hart, Junior Engineer, 2nd Class. His right hand was still holding a small handheld tool. Even unconscious, his fingers had not let it go. Salva and her team moved quickly. They lifted him onto the medical transport board, started an oxygen line, checked his pulse, and began moving toward the medical bay. Xylo stepped back to give them room. She watched them carry him out of the docking bay and down the corridor. Then she turned back to the pod. One of her engineers, a young male named Fen, was already crouching near the open door and studying the interior with a puzzled expression. "My queen," he said slowly. Whoever was inside this pod spent a significant amount of time modifying its systems. Explain. Fen pointed at the wall of the pod's interior. The original paneling had been removed. The wiring underneath had been rerouted and reconnected in ways that clearly had nothing to do with the original design. The heating system has been looped into the air recycler. It is not a standard configuration, and it should not work this efficiently. But it does. He moved his scanner along the floor of the pod. The secondary battery has been connected to the food ration storage unit. The ration packs use a mild chemical reaction when activated. Someone figured out how to use that reaction to generate a small charge and feed it back into the battery. Xylo looked at the inside of the pod. Every modification she could see had been made with simple tools and whatever was already available inside the vessel. Nothing had been brought in from outside. There was nothing in a standard Class 3 pod that should have allowed a person to survive this long. And yet here was the evidence of someone who had refused to accept that. She stood there for a long moment in the quiet of the docking bay. The hum of the ship surrounded her. The stars outside the docking bay viewport were still dark and still. She thought about the young human in the medical bay. She thought about 8 days alone in this small metal box with the air thinning and the power dying, and what it must have taken to keep working, to keep thinking, to keep finding one more small solution to one more small problem until the days had added up to something impossible. Then she turned and walked toward the medical bay. She wanted to be there when he woke up. Calvin did not wake up right away. He stayed unconscious through the first night on the Sareth Vale and through most of the second day. Salva kept a close watch on him. She gave him fluids and clean oxygen and let his body do the slow work of coming back from the edge. His heart rate steadied by the third hour. His color improved slowly. His breathing, which had been shallow and difficult at first, became more even. As the hours passed, Xylo checked on him twice that first night. She told herself it was simply a matter of protocol. She told herself she was monitoring a situation. She was not entirely sure she believed either of those things, but she let herself think them anyway. The medical bay on the Sareth Vale was a clean and well-lit space near the center of the ship. It had 6 treatment areas separated by thin privacy screens. Calvin was in the first area near the door, which made it easy for the staff to watch him and easy for Xylo to look in without making it obvious that she was looking in. She stood in the doorway the second time. She came in the quiet of the ship's night cycle and watched him sleep. He looked very young. She had thought so when they first brought him in, and the thought stayed with her now. Not young in a helpless way. There was nothing soft or unprepared in his face, even in sleep, but young in the way that meant he had not yet had enough years to become the kind of tired that never fully went away. She had that kind of tired. Most of her senior staff did. This human did not. Not yet anyway. She left without saying anything and went back to her quarters. By the morning of the second day, Salva came to her with a more complete report. Xylo sat behind her desk and listened carefully while the medic explained what the full scan had shown. Calvin had been surviving in the pod on significantly reduced oxygen for at least 6 of the 8 days. His body had adapted as best it could, but there had been real damage. His lung function was lower than normal. His red blood cell count was off. His cognitive function, Salva said, had likely been impaired in those final hours before they found him, which made it even more remarkable that he had kept making modifications to the pod systems with any degree of skill. He kept working even when his brain was not getting enough oxygen, Salva said. She said it in a flat, clinical way, but Zyra could hear something underneath the clinical tone, something that sounded like genuine disbelief. The pod's internal log recorded 23 separate system modifications over the course of 8 days. The last modification was made approximately 4 hours before we found him. By that point, his oxygen level inside the pod was low enough that most individuals would have been unconscious. Zyra was quiet for a moment, but he was not unconscious. No, he was working on the secondary coolant line. He appears to have been trying to create one more small source of heat to slow the rate at which the oxygen was being consumed. Salva paused. It was not going to be enough. He was too close to the end for one more modification to make a difference. But he was still trying. Zyra looked at the data screen Salva had placed on the desk. She studied the pod's internal log, the recorded timestamps of each modification, the notes Calvin had typed into the pod's small log function beside each one. The notes were short and practical. No dramatics, no fear written into the words, just observations and plans and small updates on what had worked and what had not. At the end of the log, the final entry, written in the last hour before the Sarath Vale's retrieval team reached him, was 4 words long. It read, "Still working on it." Zyra stared at those 4 words for longer than she intended to. She dismissed Salva and sat alone at her desk for a while after that. Calvin woke up on the afternoon of the second day. Zyra was not in the medical bay when it happened. She was in a planning meeting with Drev and 2 other senior officers. When Salva sent word, she finished the meeting before going, because the meeting mattered and because she did not want to seem eager, though she was aware on some level that she was in fact eager. By the time she reached the medical bay, Calvin had been awake for about an hour. He had already asked Salva several questions about where he was and what ship he was on and what species the crew were. Salva had answered all of them in a straightforward way. He had not panicked at any of the answers. He had not demanded anything. He had simply listened and nodded and then asked if there was water. Salva told her all of this in a quiet voice as Zyra paused just outside the medical bay. Then she stepped inside. Calvin was sitting up on the treatment table. He was still pale, but the improvement from the night before was clear. He had been given clean clothes, a simple gray shirt and trousers from the ship's supply stores that were a little too large for him, and his dark hair had been pushed back from his face. He was holding a cup of water in both hands and looking at it with the expression of someone who had thought about water for a very long time and was now having a moment with it. He looked up when she entered. Zyra stopped a few steps inside the room. She looked at him and he looked at her. She was aware that she was not an easy thing to look at for a species that had not grown up around the Kaith. She was tall, silver-scaled, 4-eyed, and wearing the dark formal coat she had not yet had time to change out of from the meeting. She looked, she imagined, exactly like what she was, which was a queen with a great deal of authority and not much visible warmth. Calvin looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for pulling me out." His voice was quiet and a little rough from the oxygen deprivation, but it was steady. He said it simply, without performance, the way someone says a true thing. "You are welcome," she said. She pulled a chair close and sat down across from him, which was not something she did with many people. She sat and looked at him, and he sat and looked back at her, and neither of them seemed to feel the need to rush into the next thing. "Your name is Calvin Hart," she said. "Yes. Junior engineer, 2nd class." He gave a small nod. "That's me. You were assigned to rest station." Something moved briefly across his face. Not panic, not grief, not yet. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a weight that was waiting for him when he was ready to carry it. "Yes," he said. Zyra watched him. She had met many people in 30 years of ruling. She had learned to read what people were not saying as easily as what they were. What Calvin Hart was not saying in that moment was filling the room, but he was holding it with care, and she respected that. "You should rest more," she said. "We will talk again when you are stronger." He nodded slowly. "Okay, then after beat," he said. "Can I ask your name?" She looked at him. "I am Zyra," she said, "Queen of the Kaith Dominion." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked down at his cup of water and said in a voice that was very calm and very tired and just slightly amused, "Okay, that's above my pay grade." Zyra stood. She turned toward the door, and she realized halfway there that something in her chest had done a small, an unfamiliar thing during that exchange. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was the feeling of being genuinely interested in another person. She could not remember the last time it had happened this quickly. By the third day, Calvin could walk. He moved slowly at first, holding the edge of the treatment table as he stood, letting his legs remember what they were. Salva watched him with a careful expression of someone who had opinions about patients trying to move too quickly. But Calvin was polite about it and moved at a pace that she could not really object to, so she let him be. He walked to the window at the far end of the medical bay and stood there for a while looking out at the stars. Zaira came in during that time and found him there very still, one hand resting lightly against the wall, just looking. She stopped in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. There was something in the way he stood at that window that she found difficult to name. He was not looking at the stars the way someone looks at something beautiful. He was looking at them the way someone looks at something they have been very close to losing, like a person who is almost drowned, standing at the edge of the water afterward and understanding it differently than they did before. He turned when he heard her step into the room. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. She had been using the human greeting because it seemed to put him at ease, and putting him at ease seemed like the right thing to do. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he said. "Legs are a little unreliable, but everything else is coming back." He looked at her for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Is it all right if I walk around the ship? I don't mean alone. I know that's probably not how it works. But I've been in a very small space for a long time, and I think my brain needs to see something other than walls." Zaira considered this. There was no security reason to refuse. He was one human with no weapons and no ship, and she understood in a way she could not entirely explain exactly what he was describing. "I will walk with you," she said. She could see that he had not expected that. She imagined he had expected a junior escort, someone assigned to watch him and answer questions in a formal and limited way. He had not expected the Queen herself. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Come." They walked for about an hour that morning. Zaira took him through the main corridors of the ship, past the engineering section, past the crew quarters, past the lower observation room. She explained what each section was as they passed. He listened to everything and asked questions that were precise and thoughtful, not the kind of questions a tourist asks, but the kind a person asks who is genuinely trying to understand how something works. He noticed things. That was what struck her. He noticed small things, and he said so without making it into a big moment. In the engineering corridor, he slowed near one of the coolant relay stations and looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then he said quietly, "That relay is cycling about 3 seconds slower than it should be." Zaira looked at him. "How do you know what it should sound like?" "I listened to your engine noise when I was walking. The bass rhythm is consistent throughout the ship. That relay is a beat off." He paused. "Sorry, I'm not trying to tell you how to run your ship. It's just how my brain works." She looked at the relay. She looked at him. Then she called Finn on the comm and told him to check the relay in Section 7 of the engineering corridor. Finn's voice came back 12 minutes later, with the news that there was a small blockage in the coolant line that had gone undetected in the last routine check. It was not critical yet. In another week, it might have been. Zyra looked at Calvin, who had been walking beside her in patient silence while they waited. How long would it have taken your engineers to find that? He asked. I am not sure, she said honestly. He nodded, not in a proud way, just in the way of someone filing information away. I'm good at noticing things that are slightly off, he said. It's what makes me a decent engineer. I'm not the fastest and I'm not the most brilliant, but I pay attention. She looked at him as they walked. Paying attention kept you alive for 8 days. He was quiet for a moment. I tried not to think of it as surviving, he said. I tried to think of it as just the next problem. What's the next problem? What do I have? What can I do with it? If I thought about the whole 8 days at once, it was too big. But one problem at a time, that was manageable. They had reached the lower observation room by then. Zyra pushed open the door, and they went inside. It was a round room with a wide curved window that looked out on the star field below the ship. There were no chairs, just a low padded ledge along the window for crew members who wanted to sit and look. It was one of Zyra's favorite places on the ship, though she rarely had time to come here. Calvin walked to the window and stood in front of it. The stars spread out below them in a wide pale river. He looked at them for a long time. Where did Wrath Station used to be? He asked. Zyra moved to stand beside him. She pointed to the right, toward a region of space that looked empty but was not, where the scattered debris field was still visible as a faint shimmer at this distance. There, she said. He looked at the spot. For a while, she did not try to fill the silence with anything. She had learned already that this human was someone who used silence the way careful people do. Not to avoid saying things, but to make room for the things that were hard to say. I keep thinking about the people I worked with, he said at last. His voice was steady but low. Lucas ran the night shift with me. He was always losing his scanner and borrowing mine. Pete was the one who knew every joke that had ever existed, and most of them were terrible. A pause. Donna kept a small plan on her desk. She was very serious about that plant. Zyra listened. I don't know why I'm the one who made it, he said. That's the part I can't figure out. I was in the maintenance shaft because I was fixing a ventilation coupling that I had put off fixing for 2 days because I kept getting distracted by other things. If I had fixed it on time, I would have been at my desk when the attack happened. He stopped. He was not asking her to respond. He was just saying it out loud for the first time, and she understood that sometimes that was all a person needed. To say it out loud to someone who was willing to listen without trying to make it smaller than it was. I am sorry, she said, just that, not more. He nodded. After a moment he said, thank you for listening. Thank you for trusting me with it, she said. He turned to look at her then, and she saw something in his expression that was open and direct and unguarded in a way she was not accustomed to seeing in adults who stood in her presence. Most people around her were careful. Most people measured every word and every look. This human looked at her like she was Simply a person he was talking to, and it was strange. And it was one of the most refreshing things she had felt in years. "You're very easy to talk to," he said. "For a queen." She held his gaze. "You are very easy to talk to," she said, "for a junior engineer second class." He smiled then, a small, real, tired smile, and she found that she wanted very much to see it again. By the fourth day, the crew of the Sarath Vale had developed opinions about Calvin Hart. This was not unusual. The crew always developed opinions about things. They were a sharp and observing group, and they had not become the most trusted crew in the Cath fleet by ignoring what was happening around them. What was unusual was the speed with which those opinions had formed, and the fact that almost all of them were the same opinion. Fenn, the young engineer who had found the coolant blockage after Calvin pointed it out, had told 3 other engineers about it by that evening. By the next morning, those 3 had told 5 more. The story had grown slightly in the telling, which was how stories always grew. But the core of it was true, and the core of it had made an impression. A human who had just survived 8 days alone in a dying escape pod had walked past one of their relay stations and heard something they had missed. The medical staff liked him because he thanked them every time they came to check on him. The docking crew liked him because he had asked intelligent questions about the pod retrieval system when one of them came to return his personal items from the pod, and had listened to the answers the way someone listens who actually cares about the answer and not just about being polite. Even Commander Drev, who was not a person who formed opinions quickly or revised them easily, had said to Zyra on the morning of the 4th day that the human seemed to have a good head on his shoulders. Zyra had simply nodded and said she had noticed the same thing. She had not said how much she had noticed. That day she invited Calvin to have a meal with her in the small dining room attached to her quarters. It was a room she used for private meetings and occasional dinners with senior staff. It was not a grand or formal space. It had a round table and 4 chairs and a wide window and a small unit that could produce food in either Cath or standard formats. She had asked Salva what human nutrition Calvin required and had made sure the unit was stocked accordingly. When Calvin arrived, he looked around the room with the same observant quietness he brought to everything. He noticed the window first, then the table, then the food that had already been set out. He sat down across from her. "This is a very kind thing to do," he said. "You have been a very easy guest," she replied. They ate without rush. The food on his side of the table was simple and plain, the kind of thing a human body needed after significant deprivation, and he ate all of it in the careful way of someone who understood what his body had been through and was treating it with patience. She ate her own meal and watched him without staring, which was a skill she had developed over many years of doing exactly that. He talked about his work when she asked. He had grown up in a small city in the Midwest of the main human continent, which she gathered was a region known for flat land and large skies and people who did not make a great deal of noise about themselves. He had always been good with systems. Machines had made sense to him in a way that other things sometimes did not. He had studied engineering because it was the obvious choice and gone to work for a station maintenance contractor. Because the pay was steady and the work was always different, and he liked the idea of keeping things running in places that most people never thought about. Nobody thinks about maintenance until something breaks, he said. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Then suddenly the maintenance guy is the most important person in the room. That is true of many things, Zaira said. The people who keep the foundation solid are rarely the ones who get noticed. He looked at her. Is that true for queens too? She considered the question. A queen who does her job well makes it look easy, she said, so people assume it is easy. The problems they never have to face are the ones she handled before they became visible. He nodded slowly. That sounds lonely. The words sat between them for a moment, and she turned it over in her mind with the careful attention she gave to things. That surprised her. It can be, she said at last. He nodded. Again, not pushing further, just accepting the answer and giving it its space. She appreciated that more than she could have said. After the meal, they sat at the table for a while longer. The ship moved around them in its steady way. Outside the window, the stars were a long, slow river. Calvin had a question. She could see it in the way he was sitting. He was the kind of person who thought about whether to ask something before he asked it, which was a quality she valued highly. He sat with it for another minute, and then he asked it. You told me you stopped for my pod because you trusted a feeling, he said. But I've been thinking about that. You're a queen. You run one of the largest ships in your fleet. You have a crew to look after and a patrol route and responsibilities in every direction. What do you do with a feeling like that when everything around you is telling you to keep moving? Zaira looked at him for a moment. It was a better question than most of her advisors had ever asked her. I have made decisions based on cold logic my entire life, she said. Military decisions, political decisions about resources and alliances and territory, and I do not regret those decisions. They were the right kind of decisions for those situations. She paused. But I have also learned over 30 years that there is a different kind of knowing. It is quieter than logic. It does not come with a list of reasons. It simply says this matters, pay attention. She looked at him steadily. When that feeling speaks, I have learned that ignoring it costs more than listening to it. Calvin looked at her for a moment, and when you saw my pod on the scan, he said. It spoke. Yes. He was quiet, then he said, I'm glad it did. So am I, she said, and she meant it in more ways than she thought he could yet understand. They talked for a long time after that. She told him things about the Caith Dominion that she would not ordinarily have shared with someone she had known for 4 days, and she was aware of this and did not stop herself. She told him about the eastern border conflict that was slowly building and the difficult choices it was going to require. She told him about the weight of standing between her people and every threat that moved in the dark. He listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions. He did not try to fix what she was describing. He just listened in the complete way that very few people ever listened to her, without waiting for his turn to speak, without calculating what he would get from the information, without performing the listening for her benefit. When she finished, he said, That's a lot to carry alone. Yes, she said simply, Is there anyone you can share it with, your senior staff family? She thought about it honestly. My senior staff sees me as their queen first and a person second. It is not their fault, it is the nature of the role. A pause. I have no family left. My sister died 11 years ago, my parents long before that. He looked at her with a directness that was gentle and unhurried. I'm sorry, he said. You keep apologizing for things that are not your fault, she said. I know. He said, I just mean it each time. She looked at him across the table in the quiet light of the small dining room, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something simple and clear and unguarded, the feeling of being seen by another person. Not a queen, not a ruler, not a symbol. Just a person in a room having a real conversation with another person who was paying attention. It was a remarkable feeling. She had forgotten how remarkable it was. The transit station was 9 days away. Zaira knew this because she had checked the navigation chart herself on the morning of the 5th day. She had stood at the navigation console in the early quiet before her crew arrived for their shifts, and she had looked at the route, and she had done the calculation, and the number had sat in her chest in a way she did not entirely like. 9 days. She had known Calvin Hart for 4 days. In 4 days he had fixed a coolant relay problem her engineers had missed, had earned the quiet respect of an entire ship's crew without trying to, and had sat across from her at dinner and listened to her in a way that had made her feel like a person again rather than a title. She put the thought away and went about her day. But the thought came back. Calvin spent the 5th day in the engineering section, which had come about because Finn had made the mistake of asking him a casual question about hull resonance dampening while they were passing in the corridor, and Calvin had answered it in a way that turned into a 2-hour conversation that pulled in 4 other engineers by the end. Zaira heard about this from Drev, who reported it with a particular tone of someone trying very hard not to have a visible opinion about it. She went down to the engineering section. In the late afternoon, Calvin was standing at a workbench with Finn and 2 other engineers sketching something on a data pad with a stylus. He was explaining something about energy rerouting that she could not fully follow, but the engineers around him were following it with the focused attention of people who were learning something genuinely useful. He was not performing, he was not trying to impress anyone. He was just a person who knew a thing and was sharing it because someone had asked. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it had started doing when he saw her. It was not quite a smile yet, a kind of opening, a quiet glad thing, as if her presence was a piece of information he received and stored somewhere warm. She noticed it every time, and every time she made a point of not reacting to it because she was a queen and she had practice at keeping her face still. She was not entirely sure her face was staying as still as she intended. They walked that evening. It had become a habit over the past few days, an evening walk through the ship. The 2 of them moving through the corridors at the slow pace of people who were not really going anywhere, but were using the going as an excuse to be somewhere together. The crew had stopped looking surprised by it. That was a thing Zaira noted. They ended up at the main observation deck. It was the widest window on the Ship, the long front-facing one where she had first seen the scan of his pod. The stars were out in their full numbers. The ship was moving at a steady speed toward the transit station, and the stars were shifting very slowly, which was visible if you looked for long enough. Calvin stood at the window for a while before he spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens when I get to the transit station," he said. Zyra stood beside him. "And what have you been thinking?" "I'll need to file an incident report, go through a debrief, probably spend a week in a human medical facility for full clearance." He paused, "and then I'll go back to work. That's what I'll do. I'll get assigned somewhere new and I'll go." "Is that what you want?" she asked. He thought about it. "I don't know yet what I want," he said honestly. "I'm still getting used to the fact that I'm here." He turned to look at her. "What about you? You'll finish your patrol and go back to the Dominion?" "Yes." "And the border situation you told me about, it will be waiting for me." He turned back to the window. "I've been thinking about something else too," he said. His voice was quiet and careful, the voice he used when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time. "I've been thinking about the fact that you didn't have to stop for my pod. You had every reason not to. No obligation, no political reason, no protocol that required it. You just stopped because something told you to." "Yes," she said, "and now I'm here," he said, "and the past 4 days have been the most real 4 days I've had in a long time, which is strange because I was in a dying pod for 8 days before this, and you would think that would be the most real thing." He paused, "but this was different. This felt like something that mattered." Zyra looked at the side of his face. He was watching the stars with that same quiet steadiness he brought to everything, the look of a person who paid attention because the world had earned his attention. "It did matter," she said. He turned to look at her. They were standing close enough that she could see the detail in his eyes, which were dark brown and very clear and full of the same careful directness they always held. He did not look away. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "After the transit station, after all the reports and the debrief and the new assignment, I'd like to know if there's a way to do that." He paused. "I know you're a queen and I'm a junior engineer 2nd class, and there's probably no sensible version of this, but I thought I should say it honestly, because I spent 8 days in a small box thinking about honesty, and I decided I wasn't going to be less honest than that. On the other side of it." Zyra looked at him for a long moment. 30 years of ruling had taught her many things. It had taught her how to read a room and how to hold a negotiation and how to stand still under pressure that would have bent most people double. It had also taught her that some things were rare, things that came without warning and without asking and sat down in front of you and expected nothing. She had learned not to dismiss those things. "The Soreth Vial passes through this region every 3 months, she said. "Standard patrol rotation. The transit station is within that region." She held his gaze. "If you are assigned to work within range of that station, and if you are willing to be available at that interval, it would not be impossible." Calvin looked at her for a moment, then that thing happened on his face again. The thing before a smile that was somehow better than the smile. 3 months, he said. 3 months, she confirmed. I can work with that, he said. I'm good at working with what I have. She held his gaze, and something in her chest did the quiet, warm thing it had been doing since the second day, since the moment he had opened his eye in the medical bay and thanked her, before he even knew who she was. I know, she said softly. I noticed. Outside the long window, the stars moved in their slow and steady way. The ship carried them both forward, through the dark toward the transit station, toward the 9 days that were already feeling shorter than they should. Neither of them moved away from the window. Neither of them spoke for a while. But between them, in the quiet and the starlight, something had been said that both of them understood, and neither of them needed to repeat. Something that had begun the moment she had chosen, without reason and without logic, and entirely on the strength of a feeling she trusted, to stop for one small pod in a very large debris field. Some things begin in the quietest way possible, and yet they become the largest things of all.